One of the things that's really misunderstood about the Klondike Gold Rush period in particular is that most people think that we're out in the middle of the wilderness with nobody around, and occasionally you would come out in a roadhouse or some such thing. In actual fact, what the situation was, it was almost a strip mall all the way from Skagway up into the creeks, so that you had people around you virtually all the time. You'd be very seldom on your own. You, for example, would be passing groups of roadhouses on a fairly regular basis, because normally once a roadhouse got successful, other roadhouses would build up around them. That was a very common situation, so that once the Grand Forks Hotel got going, then there'd be all of a sudden 4 or 5 more show up in various forms: log cabins, wall tents, and so on. So you could come onto these clumps of roadhouses / hotels / cafes on a fairly regular basis and then shop around in that area. The deciding factor, though, was quite often the fact that they were all full. So you would be bunking, in some cases in shifts. You would rent a bed for 8 hours and that's it. Or, if you got lucky, then you could get into one of the high-end places. The food that you could expect would run the gamut from very, very deluxe meals with oysters from Seattle right into what was described by one mining engineer as rat-infested soup. So you sort of had to do some shopping around, but one of the main advantages for a person to stop at these roadhouses would be the information you could get. Think that most of the people going up there to do their prospecting, their mining, had virtually no idea what they were doing. So the information they got from the other people at the roadhouses could be significant in their success, assuming that what you're being told is true. And quite often, of course, that wasn't the case. You'd be listening to stories from people who just had a story to tell more than facts to tell. So you also had to watch for that. What you could be virtually guaranteed of is great hospitality. Anybody who didn't enjoy doing this wasn't in it for very long. Their expenses were not that high, despite some of the stories about gross costs of groceries and that sort of stuff. There was huge profits available. The cost would run anywhere from 50 cents for a meal. We can assume that was one of the the not-so-good soups, up to $2.50 for a really deluxe one. $2.50 at a time when the best meal in Seattle would cost you 25 cents. The operators of these roadhouses could make easily $1,000 a day, even on a moderate-sized roadhouse. Huge, huge money. But then there was also some big hoteliers from Seattle, Vancouver, came up and opened roadhouses. Usually they would sort of high-grade the creeks and go. As soon as they weren't making $1,000 a day, it wasn't worth their time, and they would leave again. So it was the miners and that sort of people who would last longer. This roadhouse, which is the Robinson Roadhouse between Whitehorse and Skagway, is a good example of the higher-end roadhouse / hotel that you would expect to see on the Klondike Creeks. One of the great parts about this particular property, particularly the fact that it exists at all, is that this property gives you a good range of the sort of buildings that you would see. Not only the deluxe roadhouse here, but also some smaller buildings with sod roofs, mud roofs, and also a foundation that's been burned, which is unfortunately often the common fate of the roadhouses. We've got very little left now, and it really is a shame that we have so little to explain this important part of our history. This is the main Robinson Roadhouse now. It's been stabilized. The tin roof would be common in later years, but not in the early years during the gold rush and shortly after. This building in the background here with the mud roof is a good example of the mid-range sort of a roadhouse you'd find on the creeks in particular. Very basic and yet substantial accommodation, and this building would keep you quite warm even in a Klondike winter. You would find if you walked into that building right now that it'd be very cool in there even on a hot day like this, or at least hot by Yukon standards. And then we go on to another building here that had a mud roof as well that's caved in, and then the burnt foundation, the way a lot of the roadhouses looked not too long after they're built. Because they had to have huge fires going all winter, the burnt shell was quite often the fate of them.